Hi there, everyone. I'm Mark. I'm with Arato Simply Law. We're running a series of webinars on various legal topics. Today, we're joined by Wentworth Gurney, an experienced probate lawyer with Shortlands Law Firm in London, who will be sharing some valuable insights regarding probate in England and Wales. Wentworth, this is an unavoidable topic that touches all of our lives. So we're keen to understand it better. So thank you for joining us today. Could you please tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and what you were planning to cover for us today?
Hi. I've been working in probate. It's been 6 years now, and I do a mix of contentious probate and non-contentious probate. So that's probate disputes, but also administering estates as well. So it's a mix of both. Today, I was hoping we were going to talk about the most immediate things to do following the death, sadly, of a loved one. So we're not going to go into the actual probate procedure itself, but more the immediate steps that someone wants to take.
Many thanks, Wentworth. Let's start from the top, shall we? If someone's just unfortunately experienced the loss of a loved one, what immediate steps would you say they need to take?
That's a great question, Mark. So in this unfortunate situation, it does depend on where the person has died, whether that's at home or at a hospital or in a public place, and also is relevant is whether the death is expected or unexpected. If there's been an expected death at home, then the appropriate thing to do is contact the deceased person's GP or the nearest doctor, and the medical professional will then confirm the cause of death. And assuming the doctor confirms that this is an expected death, you can call a funeral director to organize the moving of the body to funeral to the mortuary. If the death happens to be an unexpected death, you're going to need to call the police and an ambulance. And the police in that situation will be the person responsible for arranging the funeral director to move the body. If the deceased died in hospital, there will be typically specialist bereavement staff at the hospital who can explain the necessary procedures and issue the documents you're going to need to register the death. In some hospitals, there may not be, and then the ward staff will have that responsibility.
That's very clear indeed. I really appreciate that, Wentworth. Thank you. Well, let's talk about property. If the deceased owned a property, such as a house or apartment, what steps would you say should be taken to ensure that it's secured?
Well, the first thing I would do is obviously make sure that the property's locked, and it is possible, if you're concerned that the property is going to be empty, to have someone step in to take care of the property. But you'll also want to ensure that the property is insured, because property insurance often becomes void on the death of the policy holder. So it's important to contact the insurer and see what the options are for providing insurance during the administration period.
Understood, Wentworth. Thank you. And I suppose related to property, in the unfortunate event that the deceased had pets, what's the best course of action to ensure that their pets are looked after?
I mean, the first thing to do, of course, is just to ensure that the pet is immediately cared for. But you'll also want to check the will, because the will often contain instructions regarding who should be responsible for taking care of the pet, and the testator, the person who wrote the will, may often also leave a gift of money to that person to assist with the care of the pet, or they may put a trust in place to provide for those costs. But the will often contain details regarding that. If the will doesn't contain details, strictly speaking, in law, the owner of the pet is the person who's entitled to inherit the residue, i.e., basically the bulk of the estate after any specific items have been given away. So ideally, you would consult that person to decide what to do about the care and the possible rehoming of the pet if that person's not able to take care of it.
Also, based on what you've been saying, it's clear that the registration of the death is really important, particularly registering a death promptly. Could you explain this process and any vital considerations for anyone listening here?
Absolutely, Mark. So that will be typically one of the first things you're going to deal with following the death, the registration of the death. And it needs to take place within 5 days. So usually the person who's going to register the death is going to be a relative. And in all circumstances, if the relative is not available, then a person who was there at the time of the death or the person organizing the funeral has the ability to register the death. Say if the death occurred otherwise than at home or hospital, then the person who found the body or the person who is currently in charge of the body will also be able to register the death. If the death is in a hospital, the hospital administrator will register the death. The way it works is that in most cases it will be the relative. In all cases, it can also be a person who was there at the time of the death or the person organizing the funeral. But if the death did not take place at home or in a hospital, then the person who found the body or who was in charge of the body can also register. If the death was in a hospital, the hospital administrator can register the death. The first thing, you will need to go to your local register office. You're not required to go to the local register office, but it does make things quicker, so we would always recommend that. Now, the register office will, of course, tell you how to register the death. In some situations, a coroner is going to be involved. A coroner is a judicial official. Well, he's not necessarily a medical professional in any way. He's a judicial official. And his responsibility is, if a death is unknown, sudden, or unexpected, his job is to find out, if necessary, who the deceased was and when, where, and how they died. If the coroner is involved, he's going to be the person who will give you the documents you need to register the death. In all cases, you should go straight to the registrar, but in some cases, you will then need to go to the coroner to get the documents needed to register the death. Now, once you've registered the death, usually the registrar is going to provide you certificates for burial or cremation. These are needed to proceed with the burial or cremation, as the case may be. Now, in certain circumstances, usually when the coroner is involved, the coroner is going to be the person who gives you these certificates rather than the registrar. But I should say that if the coroner is involved and he determines that the death is of natural causes, then it will still be the registrar. So in most cases, it's going to be the registrar, apart from if the coroner is involved and the death is unnatural. Now, if the coroner is involved, you may need to prove the death to organizations. And because the death's not yet been registered, you're not going to have a death certificate. So in that case, you can obtain an interim death certificate, which can be used to prove the death to organizations. So, for example, they can close accounts. It also allows you to apply for probate, which is, of course, something that typically is good to get on with as soon as possible, just to not delay the time it takes for people to receive their inheritance. Once the death is registered by the registrar, you're going to be able to obtain the death certificates. I'm talking about final death certificates now, which in most cases are going to be what you're going to use to prove to relevant organizations that the deceased person has died. The registrar will also assist you with the Tell Us Once service, whether by giving you a reference number, which allows you to use the service, or by helping you use the service then and there.
Thank you, Wentworth. So I guess after they've registered the death, are there organizations that need to be notified? There is this government Tell Us Once service, which I understand streamlines things. Can you tell us more about that and how that works?
Yes. The Tell Us Once service is something that takes place once you've registered the death with the registrar. He'll provide you either a reference number. You need that reference number to use the Tell Us Once service, or he will help you complete the actual use the Tell Us Once service. He'll do that with you. Now, the Tell Us Once service is effectively a way of informing multiple government organizations about a person's death at the same time. So it will inform, for example, HMRC the Department for Work and Pensions, the Passport Office, the DVLA, the local council, Veterans UK, and Social Security Scotland. Although I should say that this conversation is linked just to the law of England and Wales. As well as that, will inform some public sector pension schemes. If you go on to gov.uk, there is more information about the Tell Us Once service, so you can find out exactly which public sector pension schemes are or are not covered. Now, you aren't able to use the Tell Us Once service if the person died whilst living abroad, i.e. they were living abroad and they died abroad. In that situation, you're going to have to take responsibility for contacting the various organizations with which the deceased had assets or owed debts to yourself. So that would be a slightly lengthier process. As well as using the Tell Us Once service, because the Tell Us Once service is about informing the government, you should also you need to contact organizations that the deceased had assets with or possible debts. So banks, mortgage providers, insurance providers, utility companies, landlords, housing associations, or other organizations that the deceased had contracts with or held assets with.
That's very helpful indeed. Thank you. I suppose moving to other practical matters, funerals are an essential part of the process of saying farewell to loved ones. What is and that's obviously a very overwhelming process for obvious reasons. Could you offer any guidance, Wentworth, on who should handle this and any financial aspects that are involved, please?
Of course, that's a great question, Mark. In terms of the funeral, obviously this is a very difficult time. Now, there are different ways to organize the funeral. You can organize it through a funeral director, or you can organize it yourself. Taking into account, the stress of this time in your life, a funeral director may be the best way to go. It is sensible to choose an accredited funeral director just to ensure that you get a good quality and proper service. As well as that, there are also the local councils. Some local councils offer assistance with funerals. So they offer their own funeral services. That's typically in cases where the funeral is non-religious. There are also organizations that provide, for example, the British Humanist Association and the Institute of Civil Funerals. So in summary, what I would recommend is you can use a funeral director or do it yourself, or you can get the assistance of the local council, or there are certain organizations that assist with non-religious funerals. Now, in paying for the funeral, which is also a very sensible question, there are three possible ways of paying for the funeral. Of course, you're able to use your own money. Now, quite a large number of people might have bought a funeral plan. Now, that is where someone has effectively paid for their funeral arrangements in advance. So the nature of the arrangements has been agreed. They've been paid for. It won't typically cover all of the funeral costs, so there will still be likely other costs, but that would pay for most of the funeral. And there's also some deceased people will have had a life insurance policy with funeral expenses cover. That's slightly different. It's not that the funeral's been paid for in advance. It's that you're going to be given a specific sum of money to go towards the cost of the funeral.
No, that's very helpful, and I think it's a relief to many, I'm sure. Now, talking of financial support, what are there any kind of financial support or paid leave options that are available for those who are grieving, Wentworth?
There absolutely are. And as well as possible bereavement payments for certain categories of people, you can also get financial support for a funeral. It's a funeral expenses payment. A person who would be entitled to that are people who are on certain benefits. So you would need to check the exact requirements, which you can also check on gov.uk. If you were to do a Google search for funeral expenses payments and gov.uk, you would come up with the right result. Now, strictly speaking, in terms of the payment for the funeral, if you as the person paying for the funeral if you receive this funeral expenses payment and then later receive an inheritance from the estate, you will be required, to the extent you're able to, with that money, to pay back the government. But if you don't receive an inheritance, then it's obviously the government that pays for it. Now, in terms of, you mentioned other types of financial support. Now, that depends on the category of person you are. So, if your partner has died, then there's a bereavement support payment available, which is not means tested. So that means regardless of your financial circumstances, if you meet the eligibility criteria, then you can make a claim. You should typically make the claim within 3 months, and there is also a time limit for the claim, but I would recommend doing it within 3 months, because if you do it after 3 months, it limits the amount of money you can receive, because there's a limit to how much back payment they're able to give you, or willing to give you, I should say. And as well as that, you or your partner may be entitled to statutory parental bereavement pay in the sad circumstance that your child has died, or for stillbirths, which, of course, also another very sad topic. But a stillbirth, if the person has been pregnant for at least 24 weeks, in that situation, you and your partner may be entitled to statutory parental bereavement pay. But also, you may additionally be entitled to statutory parental bereavement leave. Now, there's certain criteria you need to meet. So there are these terms, I'm not using them in the layman's sense. They're defined for the purposes of receiving the leave or the pay. But effectively, you have to meet their definition of being a parent, a parent's partner, or someone with day-to-day responsibility for caring for the child. If it's someone with day-to-day responsibility, they'll exclude most people who are being paid for that service. Not all, but most categories. If you're being paid to look after the child, you're not going to typically be entitled to the leave or the pay. Now, for the bereavement pay only, you also have to have been continuously employed yourself for at least 26 weeks in the period before the death. And there's a minimum earning. You have to be earning a minimum amount. However, the amount is very low, so it's not going to affect most people.
Now, I'm going to ask you about solicitors, Wentworth. I know you probably have a natural bias, but I want to ask you, if someone is not sure about whether or not they should involve a solicitor in the probate process, because I appreciate there is an option always to do things yourself, DIY. But what would you say to someone about whether or not to engage a solicitor?
I do think the way you said that is a good way to summarize. I mean, apart from if a solicitor's been appointed in the will, you don't have assuming you are the personal representative, you've been appointed in the will, or you're the administrator, assuming there's no will. So you're the person dealing with the estate. There's no requirement for you to obtain the advice of a solicitor. However, the purpose of appointing a solicitor is, I guess, twofold. One is to effectively take over the work from you to minimize your workload, which is, of course, important at a time when you're dealing with bereavement. The other thing is to ensure that there are no errors made in the administration process. Personal representatives, that's the person dealing with the estate, can be personally liable. That would mean they'd have to use their own funds to pay a creditor or a beneficiary if they made a mistake in the administration of the estate. Now, as the process can be complex, interpreting the will, for example, could be something where someone could go wrong, or ensuring that the correct advertisements are placed to ensure that you're protected when you distribute the money if a unknown creditor later turns up and says, "You've distributed the money. I'm here. You didn't know about me, but I'm owed £50,000." Now, for example, a solicitor could assist with placing those statutory advertisements. And then, of course, in more complex situations as well, where, for example, you know that a beneficiary exists, but you're not able to locate him. So those kind of situations, a solicitor is going to know what to do to ensure that you have protection and what steps you can take to distribute the estate. So, of course, also if there's a dispute, you're absolutely, once again, you don't need a solicitor, but if there's a dispute, I think most people realize that having a solicitor to deal with litigation is a sensible thing.
Obviously, many people will be concerned about costs of solicitors. Are those solicitors' costs paid for upfront, or can they be paid for out of the estate?
In general, it's quite common for solicitors to be willing to take their payments from the estate once the estate has funds. That doesn't apply in all situations, but most solicitors are willing to do things in that manner. You wouldn't pay until you would obtain the grant, which confirms that you're entitled to deal with the estate. You would collect the estate assets. At that point, you would have, if necessary, you may have to sell them. But you would then have funds, and then you could pay your bill.
That's important, right? Because I think people fear, where am I going to get the money to pay for a lawyer? But obviously, if that is paid off afterwards, once distributions have come out of the estate, that obviously sets that issue at bay, for at least temporarily.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Wentworth, this is great. I mean, we've covered so much ground today. I really feel like I've learned quite a lot of new things myself. It's been very invaluable. Really appreciate it. Thank you for your time. Thank you for navigating us through probably one of the most difficult, emotional, and complex topics with clarity and compassion. So I really am grateful to you for joining us. For those who are watching this, just bear in mind that you're not alone. Arato and Simply Law has a whole lot of information on their websites, which you can view for free. And of course, we have a very large number of professionals, such as Wentworth and the team at Shortlands Law in London. Feel free to message us using the links on this page. If you have any questions that we can assist with, remember, our free chat service is available 24/7, also on this page if you're on our website. Thank you again to Wentworth and Shortlands Law Firm. Professionals like Wentworth are always ready to assist. Wentworth, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I would say, firstly, thank you so much, Mark. It's been a pleasure. And of course, this is a very stressful time for anybody, and I'm wishing anyone who suffered a bereavement the very best. And of course, if they need legal assistance, they can reach a lawyer through Arato. So I would recommend.
Thank you, Wentworth. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.